Monday morning. Today we have some really interesting things to talk about. So over the weekend, today is January 20th and January 19th, TikTok went dark. And the ban on TikTok has been the topic that everybody is talking about. Where is it going? What's happening? And I think we need to understand the underlying reasons for this TikTok ban. And it all sort of stems from data privacy, the collection of data, data security, where's it going? Who's using it? How are they using it? So there's a lot of questions still unanswered. And I think that's one of the things, Sandy, I think we kind of align on, right? Is this notion of where the hell is my data going? And I'm not clean myself. I've been a techie, but my data is everywhere. And I'm just curious, like what are some things you know? I know you've been doing some research on this as well.
Well, first of all, I want to say I got whiplash. Like, is it banned? Is it not banned? Who's buying it? Like, is it a US company? Is it a China company? Like, we don't, you know,
It's like that lover that's sitting there and plucking out the rose petals, right? Do they love me? Do they love me not? And it just goes back and forth.
I mean, I knew TikTok was a problem so many years ago when I got surprised by like a bill in my email for several $100s when my little kid bought some stuff like through the app, and I didn't realize you could do that. And I was like, oh, TikTok is banned in my house. So, um, yeah, so that it's very problematic. I am concerned about data privacy, and I think that it's a very confusing topic for a lot of people. It's kind of this all or nothing. We're picking on TikTok right now. TikTok's not the only offender here.
Yeah.
And like, I think that it's just, people are like, well, through just resigning themselves to having their data breached and collected and sold because, I mean, we've been hearing about this, right? Cambridge Analytica years ago, and just kind of this endless stream of targeted ads, targeted, information, data brokers taking your information. I mean, location data. What do we do about this, right? So like, I don't know. Let's talk about what does TikTok know? What kind of data does TikTok collect?
Everything.
Uh,
TikTok, I mean, I think TikTok has been a pretty good platform as far as video media and all this sort of content creators livelihoods, right? Like my son did this project this year. He had to teach the whole class about this TikTok ban and do the whole lineage and timeline and everything. And I found it interesting is that many of these individuals that are so worked up about TikTok being banned are they literally make a living off of this thing. And it's kind of interesting, like, okay, I'm gonna make a living off of it, creating all this content. And the people that have this app on their phone are thinking they're just consuming content, all the while they're resigning away most of the data of what they watched, who they watch, how frequently they watch it, where they are watching it from, whether it's a coffee shop, a home, or wherever. But I'd be curious. I mean, I'm sure you have a list of stuff that TikTok is collecting on on all of us as we start to use it. By the way, I don't have TikTok. Like Facebook, I don't really, I mean, I feel old at this point saying any of these things, but yeah, whatever.
you can watch TikTok videos through your other social media apps. That's also the funny thing, right?
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, user data, age, email, phone number, profile details, your device information like your IP address,
Mhm.
uh, device ID, your operating system, your network type, your device model, like your usage data, the videos watched, the ones that you like are also collected, the ones that you share, and how much time you spend on the app. Your location data, GPS if it's enabled, and your approximate location based on your IP. Your behavioral data, like your interaction patterns, preferences, and algorithm generated interests. and clipboard data if permissions are granted.
Yeah. I feel like Apple is pretty good about that. I think I've had Apples and Android as far as the amount of data that it collects. Like the thing is that not all of this is well understood as far as where to go to disable and enable and do all these things for each of these apps. Like the awareness we as consumers need to have around these things is not quite there. We're not all tech savvy. And so there's some steps obviously we need to take. But I think that there's a bigger argument here too, right? Like if they're collecting all this data, where's it going? They just put it they said Oracle is managing our data store now in the US, but prior to that, prior to the sort of initial signing from Trump to say this needs to be in the US, the data was sitting in China, right? So there was this risk of possible cyber warfare, essentially, is what drove a lot of the national security issues. But individual security also matters, right? Like I don't know that people know all this data that it's collecting. We don't have transparency on how it's being used. And I think there's a bit of a risk here that I don't know that we fully understand.
Yeah, I don't think that we understand where this data is going in general, and what that means. We just hear the buzzwords. We're like
Yep.
picking on TikTok, right? We're like, national
Clickbait. Yep.
security and China and things like that. But let me, let me break this down. Just, I'm not an expert in Chinese law, but I did do a little research on what they do, and you know, China has this many different kinds of laws to be able to access the data of the private sector companies. Okay,
Yeah.
so most relevant is the national security law
Yeah.
that they implemented actually allows them, and these other laws actually allows them to just kind of at will, without any kind of public disclosure, without any kind of due process or approval of the courts or rationale, valid rationale for collecting the data. The government can go in and pull the data or request the data from the companies, and they're mandated to comply with any kind of government request for data. And so the national security law says it's for, they do that for the purposes of national security or public security, or public welfare kind of, but it's very vague and very broad, like how or why they would collect this data. And
Yeah.
so even more than TikTok, and TikTok is kind of a Chinese company, right? So that means that the Chinese government can then collect data on how all of the millions of people in the US are using the app, but where they are located, about what kind of income range they have, what are the things that we're doing that we're or buying that we're dependent on every day, information that in the wrong hands for some nefarious actors, they can create serious disruptions or to our society, right? To our people, to our economy.
Yeah.
And so it is a national security issue. It's not even just for the United States. I mean, this has been a concern across the
Yeah.
board with China. They've been doing these infrastructure projects in the developing world, giving them very cheap, 5G access, giving them, basically connecting them to data through Chinese companies all across the world in an effort to kind of seem like they're doing humanitarian projects almost, right? Like infrastructure projects. And
Yeah.
so they're cheaper rates because they're subsidized by the Chinese government. And so these developing countries would prefer that to contract with the Chinese company. But what they're doing is all of their, a great deal of their user data is now accessible by the Chinese government at any time. So that's throughout Latin America, throughout Africa.
Yeah.
So this is, overall, this is kind of like the big thing that the US is concerned about, right? Is like, how does that
I mean,
impact our.
it's a valid concern, right? Like, US isn't the only country that has thought about or has actually banned TikTok, or even apps. Certain apps are even banned in other countries. Like India, I know, banned TikTok because they had national security concerns because they had some border conflicts with China. And, and it's interesting because it kind of comes back to our first episode, kind of discussing where do you draw that line, right? In terms of the freedom of speech, freedom of access to information. But also, if we look at this from an individual perspective, right? Like they're called influencers for a reason. They influence a lot of people, right? And when we talk about the ability for another country with potential adversarial relationships in the future or even now, there's certain trade related challenges that we're going through with them. There's an algorithmic change that could be made to these videos, right? To provide either US market consumers or any other country market consumers to be influenced in a specific way based on an algorithmic change, right? So I think that there's an aspect of that in this that we shouldn't lose sight of because even in normal games, right? Like I play Block Party with my son just to kind of compete with him, but it is it is it has ads. It has ads, and those ads, which we don't even realize, and I didn't know until you sent me the article, which, I always check the app level data, but I never thought about the data being collected when an ad is being displayed, right? And that's actually called real-time bidding. And real-time bidding is pretty serious because not even the app developers sometimes know what data is being collected through these ads, and it's going straight to these data brokers, right? Which is just a pretty big concern to me because I didn't consent to giving you that, right? So is consent becoming an issue, or is it that because I downloaded this app, I'm agreeing to seeing these ads, therefore there's a sort of implied agreement or consent here? I wonder, like, what do you think of that?
I think nothing is free in this world.
I
So
mean,
if
listen,
you're downloading anything that's free, then you're basically watching really annoying ads, which that's what we usually focus on, right? This is really annoying. But every single time you're looking at one of those ads, the company's pulling your data. And that's how come it's free, right? It's like somebody needs to make money.
yeah.
Um, I mean, it's really about being a kind of mindful consumer, but before that, the point you made really is this privacy versus security issue, right? And this, so you can, I talk to many people who are just kind of like, especially the young people, because I teach in a university. So
Yeah.
young people, more than maybe I was at their age, for sure, are like, okay, so they have access to this data. Big deal,
Yeah.
right? It's like I'm not doing anything wrong. So why do I care if they know what brand of toilet paper, I'm interested in buying, right? Like,
Yeah, exactly.
um, and and I think this is it's a very slippery slope for us to think that way,
But we've
because
been
there's
conditioned to think that way. I think that's the thing.
yeah.
It's like the younger generation is conditioned to think this way, that it's okay to share all your stuff. Here's all this free stuff that I'm giving you as a result of it. Look at this, who's shiny, right? But yeah,
I
it's
mean,
crazy.
I don't know, we don't even have time in this podcast to get into this kind of like conditioned conformity that we're,
Could be a future podcast.
like if you've actually grown up in a world where you don't have to be scared of everything that you do wrong being posted on social media and like have this kind of constant messaging of how you should be as a human being, you
Yeah,
know, it's going to create like a very different kind of relationship, like societally with
yeah,
people, to have that kind of, like you're saying. But the privacy versus security is a huge debate because I don't even think we can define what privacy really is to people anymore. Like, what is it? What are our values around privacy? But the debate is basically, I've worked in the anti-trafficking movement for 15 years or more than that, actually, 20 something, well, whatever. But I don't want to date myself on a podcast about technology. But but there's this idea that like it's totally okay to be able to have access to data, surveillance information, all of that stuff if it helps us to get human traffickers, for example, or if it helps us to recover kids that have been trafficked, right? And
Yeah.
help them. And, you know, we've been seeing that with like facial recognition technology and all kinds of surveillance tech being used by law enforcement. Law enforcement wants backdoor access to your Apple so that they can, you know, make sure that they get the criminals. So
Yep.
this is a really big kind of debate that may, you know, maybe we don't talk about debate this, you know, in daily
It's a
life,
counter argument, right? Like
but
I
this is
do
a huge
think,
deal. Like, do we want this information? Do we want to know? Anyway, Wired's article came out about the data brokers and the data hijacking, and the really interesting video on there about Epstein. Speaking of trafficking, so Jeffrey
yes.
Epstein and his you know, his little island, his Epstein
Yeah.
Island there, and the Wired investigators basically used publicly available data that was pulled from the phones of people that went to that island.
Let me tee up that video. I
Yeah.
actually have it available. Let's watch just a clip of it, and then it's an interesting counter argument to be made is should we allow data to be collected for good? You know, it kind of goes back to the good and not the use of it, the intent of it, right? So just give me a second. I'm gonna tee it up here and we'll watch it.
Even in death, the secrets of Jeffrey Epstein remain tightly guarded. But earlier this year, I spearheaded a Wired investigation that uncovered the data of almost 200 mobile phones belonging to visitors to his infamous pedophile island. The data was so precise, we were able to map the paths of these visitors to within centimeters, including their neighborhoods, buildings of origins, and the paths they took to get to the island. These digital trails document the numerous trips of wealthy and influential individuals seemingly undeterred by Epstein's status as a convicted sex offender. Wired's analysis of the data is ongoing, and it raises profound questions about privacy and surveillance.
Yes, it does raise a lot of questions.
If you actually continue the video, you'll see the part where they put all the dots and the dots in
Yes,
various
I saw
places
that.
on the island and like the trails through the water to the other islands and like where they are in the United States and stuff. And he makes actually an interesting and kudos to Wired investigators because they basically said we're not releasing the names because these could also be the domestic workers and like the gardeners and everybody that's actually
Yes.
working, and it could jeopardize their privacy, you know, so they're not going to release the names, but they
Oh, but
they
there was a data
access them.
breach
They can
after. So after this article came out from Wired, Gravy Analytics, which was the company that collected all this data that they used, had a data breach that the NSA reported, and that was on January 16th. So the article came out on January 9th, and all of a sudden there's a data breach on January 16th for the data sets that Gravy Analytics is collecting. I just find the timing of it to be very interesting around this, right? So yeah, they're great. I mean, I think this research was amazing, in my opinion, because I think this is the type of work that we need to be doing is to be able to help the community. But the moment you put it out there, there's a lot of people who want to get at this, right? So
but that what you know what where's the line, right? So say you put it out there, say it's completely transparent. You're like, let's make this data from these phones of all these you know, random people or whatever completely transparent for the world. So are we creating a situation where we're just going to be our own vigilantes? We're just going to do witch hunts? You know, does this like, you know, it violates kind of due process. It violates
yeah,
the, you know, like our constitutional rights in the United States. You know what I'm saying? So I
yeah,
think that's I think that there's like a kind of outrage culture online.
yeah.
We want that data. We want to be able to like, you know, dox all these people and make their lives hell and cancel them. Um, but at the same time, I think that we need to look at privacy and we need to understand that privacy is so important. And how do we define privacy
Yeah.
today?
I mean, doxing is a big deal, right? So for those who don't know what doxing is basically where I can collect all of your information that's publicly available. that can create a profile of you and be able to use that in some way to get at you, right? And it's basically documenting everything you know about a person. And there's a lot of information we all have out on the internet. It's too much information, in my opinion, sometimes, right? And it came to a head because now we're getting to a point where we have these, we talked about this, the glasses, Meta came out with them. There was I think a Kickstarter.
I
Um,
wanted them so bad. It's not Meta. It's not Meta. Meta
no, it
glasses
was
are
a different
cool.
one. There was a Kickstarter for a
There's a
different company.
there's a
Yeah.
Kickstarter AI glasses
Yeah.
that purportedly you can wear around your house and like do things like look inside your refrigerator and say, what can I make with all these ingredients in my fridge? And it will pull up like a list of things you can make, and
Yeah.
then you can ask it for the recipe, and it basically engages in an augmented reality with you throughout the day. And I was like, those look really cool. I want,
I mean, listen, I
I
want to be the
want
Jetsons.
those.
We're in the Jetsons era at this point. For those of you who know what Jetsons is, you're my people. So,
But I used mindful consumerism and I said, I am going to take a pause and I am going to investigate some things about this technology to see if
yeah.
this is like kind of over the threshold of what I find acceptable for, data protections.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah. I mean, it's hardware and app related stuff that we need to be aware of. Like you talked about going on an app diet, which I love because it's
I
such
went
a
on an app
unique way to putting
diet.
it.
That was
I
my
mean,
new
listen, what is an
resolution.
app diet, by the way? Just so everybody knows. I know because you and I've talked about this a little bit too much sometimes, but
All right,
um,
all right. I nerded out and I upgraded my phone. And when I did that, I wanted to make everything nice and clean, but I wanted to have like a fresh slate. So I went through and I spent some time, as we know, it will take a little bit of chunk of time. I went through every single one of my apps. And if I
yeah,
haven't used them, or if they have some stupid in-app purchase that I'm never gonna buy or anything, like I was just kind of like, if I haven't used this in a year, I'm not gonna use it. It's like cleaning out your closet, right?
yeah,
I like Marie Kondoed my phone. And I deleted a bunch of apps. I deleted maybe like 70% of the apps on my phone because I was like, I'll never use these. And then I'm also going in and making sure that like the apps that I'm interested in, I'm actually paying attention to the details, right?
yeah,
So I'm paying attention to things like who made the app. Like you go into the app store and you look at all the developer details, right? What are the ratings, whatever, those can be faked, right? So,
yeah,
but who made the app and where are they from? Like where's the company from? That's because where they're from determines who has access to their data, right? Who's hosting their data that
yeah.
they get from you. So, um, and then like how old is the company? What other apps have they made? So I look at all of these things kind of, I want to see things like, um, you know, obviously where they're located, but is this kind of a dead app? Has it not been updated in 3 years? If it
Yeah.
hasn't been updated in 3 years, it's a security vulnerability, right? Like
Very much. Yep.
easily hackable. They're also not giving you new features anyway. So you know, what other apps have they made? What data do they access? Because it tells you what data they access. But then I also want to look in the terms. I do.
Yeah.
I'm not a nerd that reads like the entire terms and conditions, but I do scroll down to the part where what we can do with your data.
Yeah.
And I look at that. And then I make the determination whether it's worth it to me.
I mean, even so, like, I think the one thing I actually do like about Apple, which I'll never claim I like Apple, even though I use Apple phone, and it's just because I was so used to the Android OS and how it was structured that it drives me crazy some of the ways that Apple's got it set up. But, obviously it's intuitive for those that have been using Apple for a while and it's great. But I actually really like the feature where it says ask the site or the app not to track
Yes.
across platforms or across
Don't
sites,
track.
right? You should always say no. And the reason, and it can be a little bit of an inconvenience, I get it, right? But the reason you want to say that is because there's a lot more information you're storing on your phone than you would be on any other device. I mean, the browser doesn't have access to your device unless you explicitly go and do that, right? And on the phone, however, it could be just defaulted, right? So be mindful. I think, there's a lot of people that won't go to the terms, won't go look at the data privacy materials that many of these websites already have, many of the apps have. And what I found interesting is it's actually an opt-out model. And for those that kind of want to understand what opt-out is, really, they've selected yes for you. It's like by signing up or by downloading, you're agreeing to our terms of use. And from a legal standpoint, that's great. They're covering their behinds, right? But as a consumer, that's legalese that's not easy to read. But guess what we have now? We have something called a chat AI. You can go to Anthropic, you can go to OpenAI, you can go to any of these chats that are out there and put in the link and say, tell me in layman terms or in human terms, not legalese, right? What does this mean for my data? And you don't have to read it, right? And it will tell you how is it being used, and you can ask those questions to make your life a little bit easier so you don't have to go through all the terms and stuff. Like I barely use any apps on the phone. My phone is largely to call people, to text message people, to take pictures and videos, and that's the extent of which I use it. And now I use it for work as well. But you know, it puts a level of risk that we shouldn't be putting on ourselves, right? And I think we need to become more mindful and aware of where we go and go on an app diet like Sandy did.
Yeah, well, I think that we need to talk to your mom about the Candy Crush.
I mean, listen, this woman is addicted to this game. I can't even tell her to get off of it because she's just like, nope, this is my life. This is what I do in retirement is sit down and play Candy Crush. So, Candy Crush creators, can you please deactivate her account? Because I'm tired of paying for those candies that she keeps buying on your app. Just saying. It's
But
crazy. I
Candy
think
Crush is one of the apps that was highlighted in this article about the recent breach from the data brokers, right?
I
Candy
mean, I
Crush,
use one of them, my fitness pal.
MyFitnessPal. Yeah.
I use it. I think, there's so many apps out there. I mean, Tinder was one of these apps as well, right? On this article, MyFitnessPal was an app that was being used that collects all this data, and we give it health data, right? And I've been in the data analytics world for so long. Like I remember one of the companies that I worked for, it was a startup, and we had a biz dev lead, who I won't name here, but he knows who he is. If he listens to this podcast, he'll know what I'm talking about. One day I went up to him and I said, "Hey, can you tell me, this was a analytics that we were trying to create for sales and marketing so that the salespeople knew what to say to kind of make the connection a bit more warmer." I was like, can you tell me if like we can capture data like where they go for coffee, maybe where they go and, hang out with people, and could we maybe even also get like all of their like history and information of the schools and the activities and the things they like on Facebook and things like that. And he's like, yes, stalker, I think we can try to get that. And I just couldn't stop laughing because he's right. That's stalker data, people. And it's unfortunately available for you, as Sandy pointed out, as this Wired article pointed out, and we'll definitely link it in the comments of the podcast and the video on YouTube. But it's critical for us to understand that data is now the most valuable asset that any of these companies can own. And guess who controls this asset? You. You're the person that actually volunteers to give your information. And the moment you stop doing that, the moment you stop putting your information in the hands of people that can be using it in any which way they please, because that's what the terms usually say, that's when we start to get into trouble around this stuff. And that's when it actually goes from the individual to even at the country level, like we talked about, as being a more of a national security issue. Because a lot of these people that went off of TikTok went off to this Chinese app, right? And it just blows my mind. I'm like, no, 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 stop to think before you do this, because this is not okay. Like, I get you want to continue to do what you do, but understand the risks before you do it.
Yeah.
So with that,
Oh,
I think,
and from
yeah.
a policy perspective, this is really interesting because in that video with the Epstein data,
Yeah.
The investigator actually said that they don't see the dots over Europe. And it's not because there's nobody in Europe, it's just because
GDPR.
Europe has good privacy and data protection laws.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And they try to make sure, and it's one of the strictest, right? Is what I've found when I've worked with the European companies or even my European counterparts when I worked for a global company. It was very clear that we could not collect a lot of this data without explicit consent to collect it. And, working in pharma, patient data was a very big deal, right? And GDPR, in my opinion, US needs to have it, right? If we're going to start protecting our people and protecting our national security, it's critical to implement the policies that are there similar to GDPR, right? And we don't have to go to the extent in some cases that GDPR does, but it is a very clear set of guidelines. And it's very important, for our government, for our product developers to take that into consideration. It's one of the things we did, right? When we developed Ruth and launched Ruth, we didn't go with Google Analytics, which is what it's not GDPR compliant. So even for the people that are using it here in the US, we are GDPR compliant for the people that are using it in the US. And it was a conscious decision we made around this, right? But then there's that counter argument, right? Is they were able to trace all these people to Epstein's Island, at least in the US, we can catch all these guys, right? But is there that line that we're crossing when it comes to being able to track people without their consent, um, if it means that we're going to capture bad guys,
The
right?
reality is they didn't need that data to capture the bad guys. So like I just want to make that clear. Like that
I get it.
it helps the case, I suppose. But
I think it's more evidence, right? I think evidence matters in many cases. It gets thrown out when you're super powerful, um, but I do think that data can help or hurt people, and like technology needs to be carefully provided. And I think that ownership sits with us and in everything we do and use, because this world is a digital world. We can't live without. We can't be hermits. Like that just can't happen. Although I'd love to be a hermit and not have to deal with people, but um, that's not the reality. And with that, I will say this was an awesome discussion. I love it. Would love to hear your thoughts on what you think about this discussion, what you feel needs to happen with data privacy. Should regulations be put in place similar to GDPR here in the US? And make sure you like and subscribe to our channel and also check out our podcast. It's on Apple and on Spotify. Till next time. See you guys.
thanks.
Peace.